Mental illness, possible ghosts, a creepy colonial mansion, and a former nursery with barred windows, rings in the wall, and a bed that's nailed down, all overseen by a man who insists he knows what's best for a woman and prescribes isolation, silence, and obedience as medical treatment. That is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1892 short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, and that is what we are going to talk about today. If this is your first time here, my name is Dr. Whitney Kosters. I am a professor of English, and this channel is a growing library of lectures on classic literature and academic writing, with a particular focus on texts that tend to confuse, unsettle, or frustrate readers. If that sounds useful, feel free to take a look around and subscribe because I post regularly, and I create these lectures so that they can be returned to again and again. If you're here right now, though, it's probably because The Yellow Wallpaper unsettles you in a way that's hard to pin down. You may have been told that it's a feminist critique of marriage and 19th century medicine, which it absolutely is. But you may also feel like there are moments in this text that don't quite fit that explanation. Moments that feel stranger, darker, and more destabilizing than we're usually prepared for in a straightforward domestic narrative. And that tension, that sense that something doesn't quite add up, is exactly where this interpretation begins. It's also worth noting that The Yellow Wallpaper is drawing heavily on the Gothic tradition, which helps explain why the story feels so unsettling in ways that go beyond social critique. Gothic literature often centers on decaying or oppressive spaces, blurred boundaries between sanity and madness, unreliable perception, and the sense that something hidden is exerting control from beneath the surface. Haunted houses, imprisonment, paranoia, and the feeling of being watched or trapped are all classic Gothic elements, and Gilman uses those conventions not simply for atmosphere, but to externalize the narrator's psychological and social confinement. Reading the story through a Gothic lens helps us understand why it feels eerie and destabilizing even when nothing overtly supernatural is confirmed. What I want to do here is walk through two different ways of reading The Yellow Wallpaper, not in order to decide which one is right, but to show how interpretations take shape, how claims emerge from patterns in a text, and how evidence either strengthens or undermines the way we understand a story. One of the most common readings of The Yellow Wallpaper is certainly a feminist one, and to understand that interpretation, we need some historical context because Gilman was writing at a time when patriarchy and the cult of domesticity shaped nearly every aspect of women's lives. Women were expected to exist almost entirely within the private sphere, devoted to home, husband, and children, while men occupied the public world of work, politics, and intellectual life. This ideology was reinforced not only socially, but medically, through the belief that women's bodies had a finite amount of energy and that mental exertion, including reading and writing, was dangerous to female health. Gilman herself experienced this firsthand when she was treated for depressive episodes by Dr. Weir Mitchell, the nation's most prominent nerve specialist, who prescribed what was known as the rest cure, a treatment that required enforced bed rest, isolation, overfeeding, and the complete elimination of intellectual activity. Women undergoing this treatment were forbidden to read, write, or work, and they were expected to submit completely to the authority of their doctors and husbands. In her later essay, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, Gilman explains that the story was written as a critique of this treatment and as a warning about the damage it caused. Now, read through this lens, the narrator's breakdown becomes a powerful indictment of a system that silences women and medicalizes their resistance. From the beginning, the narrator tells us that she doesn't believe she is truly sick, that she feels congenial work and social interaction would help her. But John dismisses her feelings as silly fancies, and he insists that she submit to his authority. He infantilizes her, calling her little girl and little goose, manages her schedule, controls her body, and frames her dominance as love and care. Their relationship, as many readers notice, resemble a parent-child or doctor-patient dynamic far more than a partnership between equals. Now, this reading gains even more force when we look at the room she's confined to, a former nursery at the top of a large colonial mansion. The windows are barred, the bed is nailed down, the walls are scratched and gouged, and the floor is splintered, all signs of confinement and resistance. The wallpaper itself becomes a symbol of domestic entrapment, with its sickly color, its chaotic pattern, and eventually the figure of a woman trapped behind it, shaking the bars and creeping along the walls. As the narrator identifies more and more strongly with this woman, her mental state deteriorates, suggesting that the very treatment meant to cure her has instead driven her into madness. However, careful reading also means paying attention to the moments that complicate this interpretation, because there are details in the text that, once noticed, make the story feel less like a woman slowly going mad in an ordinary house and more like a narrator whose grasp on reality may have been unstable from the very beginning. If this is simply a rented summer home, why does it look so much like an institution? Why are there rings in the walls, barred windows, a gate at the top of the stairs, and a bed that is not just heavy, but nailed down? Why does the narrator later discover yellow smooches all over her clothes that match the smooch that runs endlessly around the room, even though she initially describes the mark as something left behind by others? Why does she express surprise that her shoulder fits perfectly into that groove, as though she herself has been tracing it for a very long time without fully realizing it? There are also questions about the people around her. The child is mentioned repeatedly, but never appears. Jenny, who is described as John's sister, behaves much more like a nurse monitoring the narrator and cleaning the room. John's reactions, particularly near the end when he cries out for an axe upon finding the door locked, feels strangely theatrical for someone who is supposedly accustomed to medical crises. And then there is the rope, which the narrator hides and secures, claiming it's for her own protection, even as she creeps endlessly around the room, following the path worn into the wall. Taken together, these details allow for an alternative interpretation, one in which the narrator is not a wife temporarily confined by her husband, but a patient in a mental institution who is reconstructing her reality through delusion. In this reading, John is not her husband, but her primary physician. The brother, another doctor, and Jenny, a nurse. The marriage narrative becomes part of the narrator's attempt to make sense of her confinement, and the creeping woman behind the wallpaper is not simply a symbol of domestic oppression, but a fractured version of the self, projected outward because the narrator can no longer recognize her own actions as her own. What matters here is not choosing between these interpretations, but understanding how they're built. Both rely on patterns in the text. Both draw on specific details, and both attempt to explain not just isolated moments, but the story as a whole. Strong interpretations don't eliminate ambiguity. They actually account for it. The Yellow Wallpaper endures because it resists a single stable meaning. Whether it's read as a feminist critique of marriage and medicine, a psychological portrait of institutionalization, or a text that deliberately blurs the line between the two, the story forces readers to confront uncomfortable questions about power, authority, and the fragility of identity. That unease, that lingering sense that something is wrong, even when we think we understand what's happening, is not a flaw in the story, but the reason it continues to be read and argued over more than a century later. And this is what is so compelling about literature to me. A text doesn't arrive with a single meaning sealed inside it, waiting to be uncovered once and for all. It changes as we change. We might read this story one way the first time we encounter it, and then come back to it years later with more experience, context, or simply more patience for ambiguity and see something entirely different. That doesn't mean the earlier reading was wrong. It just means interpretation is not static. This idea is something I talk about more directly in my lecture on Roland Barthes and the Death of the Author, where Barthes argues that once a text is released into the world, its meaning is no longer controlled solely by the author's intentions, but shaped by readers, context, and time. The Yellow Wallpaper is a perfect example of this. Gilman may have written the story with a specific purpose in mind, but the text itself continues to generate new questions and interpretations long after that moment has passed. So I'm curious how this story worked for you. Did you find one interpretation more convincing than the other, or did the text resist settling into a single explanation? Did your understanding shift as you moved through the story? If this kind of reading, one that stays close to the text, takes confusion seriously, and treats interpretation as something that can evolve, is useful to you, then I will remind you that there is a whole archive of lectures on literature and writing on my channel. Feel free to explore and subscribe if you'd like to keep coming back to these conversations. Be well.